talk about the brain. On the 2nd of April 2013, President Barack Obama announced the launch of the Brain Research through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies initiative. Brain and a number of other projects, like the Allen Brain Atlas, are large-scale collaborative efforts working to develop detailed anatomical and functional maps of the brain. These neural snapshots have the potential to grant untold new insights into poorly understood brain functions and disorders. Sounds great. All that needs to be done to complete some of these maps is to accurately measure and record the location and characteristics of about 86 billion neurons, each with up to several thousand connections, meaning over 100 trillion synapses to potentially simulate. These are unintuitively large numbers, difficult to appreciate. If you were to count every neuron in just one brain at a rate of 1 neuron per second, it would take you a little over 2,700 years. There are estimated to be around 100 billion neurons in our entire bodies, which is the same number of stars estimated to be in our galaxy. In the same year Brain was announced, it took the K supercomputer with its 10 quadrillion operations per second of computational power 40 minutes to simulate a single second of brain activity in a neural network about 1% the size of our own. Come on, K. That was only like 10.4 trillion neural synapses. I can do that and some in like a second. What are all these connections for? Why so many? Are they us? Are the electrical networks in our heads the building blocks of consciousness? Well, exactly how neural networks give rise to things like creativity, personality, self-awareness, and our ability to simulate the future or accurately recreate the past is still a mystery. But these are all things happening exclusively in the head. What about things going on in the rest of us? If you think about it, it almost feels like we are just the brain, living inside the head and peering out through the eye sockets. Without its meat mech suit and the equipped arsenal of detection and movement systems, the brain is deaf, blind, mute, unable to feel pain, and completely immobile. It uses the body to sense and perceive the world, to move throughout it, to interact with things, and to keep it alive. So, how does the brain control the body? Well, let's begin with the nervous system. Humans have a single, highly expansive nervous system. With such a diverse range of functions and responsibilities, it's often easy to understand them in smaller portions, giving rise to our first major division. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and can be simplistically thought of as a central control station. Before we explore how the nervous system generates movement, we need to understand a bit about our senses. The central nervous system receives a constant flow of sensory information coming from all over the body, and through a process called integration, it decides what each signal means, which ones to ignore, which ones to respond to, and how to respond. The preparation and controlled execution of body movement is a complicated thing, tightly linked to sensory processing. Without the precise and continuous perception of things like limb positioning, balance, spatial orientation, and our interaction with objects, movement can be ineffective, inappropriate, and uncoordinated. This process of input, integration, and response can involve a colossal network of connections for even the most simple tasks, like deciding to eat an apple. First, photoreceptors in our eyes capture a two-dimensional image of the environment, which includes the apple. We then process this image in the brain using optical cues like parallax and perspective to perceive the object as three-dimensional. We then pass this information around the brain, associating it with things like memories of what an apple is to interpret it as something familiar. We then associate this familiarity with biological needs like hunger to determine that we want it. We can then conceptualize eating it and formulate a series of motor actions required to get the apple. We then pass these commands throughout the body, initiating movement, and we can get the apple. Without the initial sensory input, we have no reason to move, no knowledge of the apple or what's around us. Even if we did somehow know about it, exactly how to move, what muscles to contract in what order to actually get the apple, would be a guessing game. I realize this sounds like a lot just to eat an apple, and that's because it is. And it happens in the blink of an eye, thanks to a pretty incredible cell called a neuron. Neurons, sometimes called nerve cells, are the functional building blocks of the nervous system, specialized for receiving and transmitting electrical impulses at incredible speeds. Neurons have a cell body, housing life-sustaining elements like the nucleus, and an axon, which uses ionized mineral concentration gradients to conduct electrochemical impulses, also called action potentials, down the length of the cell. Once the action potential reaches the axon terminals, neurotransmitters are released. Dendrites, located on other neurons, then pick up these signals and initiate their own action potentials. These cells essentially form biological power lines through which information can be shared around the body. But these lines are not fixed. They have the capacity to change and evolve and reorganize themselves in response to experience, giving them the property of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity grants us the capacity to learn, adapt, memorize, and specialize, and gives the nervous system some pretty incredible qualities. For example, brain imaging studies on individuals born completely blind have shown the activation of brain regions normally dedicated to visual processing in response to non-visual sensations, such as braille reading and language processing. These essentially unused visual brain regions are repurposed and take on new functions, thanks to this adaptive quality of our neurons. Speaking of brain functions, most of them arise from the coordination of different regions, passing information back and forth. But to help us understand the brain, it can be useful to divide it into lobes that indicate an area's general responsibilities and specializations. The frontal lobe is responsible for many higher-order functions, like reasoning and attention, but it also contains a large chunk dedicated to movement. This is our premotor area, which coordinates with structures like the cerebellum to create specific, goal-focused movement plans that contain exact sequences of muscle contractions, postural adjustments, and tons of fine-tuning. These plans are then sent to the primary motor cortex, which fires the final motor command out to the body to begin movement. The parietal lobe has many functions as well, including language comprehension and some visual integration, but perhaps its primary role is the processing of sensations arising from the body, also known as somatosensory inputs. Somato, or somatic, originates from the Greek somaticus, meaning of the body, and sensory inputs coming from the body enter the primary somatosensory cortex to be processed. This area turns the firing patterns of a sensory neuron into a perceivable sensation, like pain. Pain, felt in your wrist, for example, is not actually felt in your wrist at all. Nociceptive neurons in your hand send a series of action potentials up to the brain, which interprets them as pain. Where you feel the pain is dependent only on where that neuron terminates in the brain. These two lobes in particular are essential for our perception of bodily sensations and the production of movement. The other portion of the central nervous system is the spinal cord, which carries most of these sensory inputs and motor outputs between the body and brain. If we slice the spinal cord in half and take a look from the top down, we see this. Yeah, the spinal cord is tiny, only about 6.5 to 14 millimeters in diameter. Zooming in a bit, we can see a distinct inner grey matter, which is mostly the cell bodies of certain neurons, and an outer white matter, made of axons traveling through the cord, grouped into specific tracts based on where they're going or what sort of sensations they carry. Motor tracts contain the axons of motor neurons that generate movement, and each tract carries neurons responsible for different motor functions, such as voluntary limb control or unconscious posture coordination. Pathways running in the lateral corticospinal tract, for example, consist of an upper motor neuron originating in the motor cortex, which synapses onto a lower motor neuron in the spinal cord. Lower motor neurons then exit the cord, terminate on muscles, and stimulate contraction when an action potential fires, moving the body. We also have sensory tracts that transmit sensory information to the brain. These tracts are not based on sensation location, but sensory modality, meaning the type of information, like temperature or pressure. The dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, for example, involves a first-order neuron that detects a stimulus and fires an action potential that ascends the spinal cord. A second-order neuron then takes this signal to the thalamus in the brain and a third-order neuron takes it to the primary somatosensory cortex so we can feel it. The spinal cord is a lot more than just a means of transport for these tracts though. It coordinates reflexive actions, like pulling our hands away from a hot stove. This process doesn't require us to perceive the heat, think about how it's hot and might burn us, and then move in response. No, the spinal cord knows will take way too long, so it just does it. It also contains central pattern generators, short neural circuits that produce rhythmic, repeating patterns of motor output without requiring input from the brain. Actions like walking might be consciously initiated, but the brain quickly hands them off to these spinal circuits so we can think about other things and essentially just walk automatically. The central nervous system essentially determines how and why to move through sensory processing and generates the signals that actually get the body moving. But how do these sensations get from the body to the spinal cord? That's a long distance to travel. And where do these motor outputs go from their spinal tracts? Well, let's travel outside central control and into the peripheral nervous system. This division encompasses all nervous tissue outside the brain and spinal cord. It is the expansive network connecting central control to all the structures it monitors and influences. These networks are formed predominantly through nerves, which are cable-like bundles of sensory and motor axons taped together in layers of connective tissue. Like the spinal cord, let's examine the sensory and motor divisions of this system separately. The somatic sensory division is ancient, having evolved even before hearing and vision. This system communicates the state of the body to the brain via a huge variety of receptors residing in every corner of our bodies. Perpetual transmission of sensations like touch, temperature, pressure, vibration, proprioception, and more coming from areas like the muscles, the joints, the skin, the body wall, tell the brain how the body is interacting with the world. We also have receptors in and around our organs, giving rise to the visceral sensory division. Sensory neurons have all the elements of our typical neuron with the addition of a sensory ending. These can range from basic to exceptionally complex, but all function to detect some change in their environment, like a mechanical or a chemical one. Upon detection of a change, also called a stimulus, all that a sensory neuron really does is initiate an action potential that fires down their axon, through a nerve, into the spinal cord, and up to the brain so we can feel it. Well, I mean, they can't all just be that, not all sensors. Surely there's more to some of them than just electrical signals, right? Let's say we've got vision, hearing, equilibrium, smell, touch, proprioception, nociception. I mean, come on. If that's really the case, who's to say we aren't just a brain in a vat of life-sustaining fluid being fed electrical stimulus that simulate true reality? Seriously. The brain in a vat scenario proposes that a fake reality simulated by a supercomputer and fed to our brain in the form of electrical signals, identical to the ones it typically receives, could be indistinguishable from reality. And while criticized, this premise is difficult to disprove. The thought experiment is perhaps more of a talking point to promote discussions of consciousness and reality than it is a serious scientific question worth investigating. But it does serve as a good analogy for how we actually perceive the world. As far as we know, everything you think and feel and experience is ultimately the result of neuron firing patterns isolated in the brain. And the body is really just the vessel that facilitates experience and keeps the brain alive. The somatic motor system innervates every skeletal muscle in our body, allowing us to move our skeleton, and, well, the rest of us just sort of comes along with it. Most of the pathways that control these muscles are essentially just the reverse order of our sensory ones. We have a motor command generated in the motor cortex, which is sent down the spinal cord, out through a nerve, and down the axon of a lower motor neuron, causing muscle contraction. Running, breathing, eating, talking, dog grooming, pretty much just moving in any way, is completed through this division. Next is the autonomic nervous system, an extremely widespread network involved with coordinating bodily functions and keeping us alive. Autonomic is derived from autonomous, meaning self-governing, as the system acts without conscious direction, influenced by structures like the hypothalamus. This is great. It means we don't need to think about regulating things like pupillary dilation and can remain oblivious to all honestly mundane but absolutely necessary life-sustaining processes coordinated by the autonomic nervous system. In fact, even if we wanted to feel and control some of these processes, it might be difficult. As we've seen, sensations are perceived and experienced in particular brain regions, and if information doesn't enter these areas, well, we're probably not consciously perceiving it, and it's hard to control something you're not even aware is happening. For example, right now, can you consciously decide to dilate the blood vessels in your intestines? Most visceral sensory information enters the brainstem via the vagus nerve. It doesn't enter the primary somatosensory cortex, where we feel bodily sensations, or any other brain region that forms part of our conscious perception. So not only do we not feel it, but we most likely have little to no control over it. Oh, sorry. I was just trying to increase pancreatic secretions. The autonomic nervous system can be further divided into two main subsystems that oppose each other and carry out a perpetual balancing act inside the body. The sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight division that prepares you to deal with life-threatening situations. Pupillary dilation enhances your vision. Bronchodilation allows you to breathe deeper, and sweat production prepares to cool the body to keep it running efficiently. Oh yeah, you're ready to fight off that saber-tooth, run from a rhino, or present your project in front of the class, or ask your crush out on a date. Thanks to a few years of evolution, we have this epically sophisticated, highly attuned system for dealing with fear and danger that can't exactly tell the difference between "I'm about to be eaten" stress and the stresses of social pressure or the fear of rejection. Counter to this is the parasympathetic nervous system. This division has been dubbed the rest and digest system and acts like a brake. It slows the heart rate, decreases blood pressure, and powers up digestive processes. This system takes control when we're relaxed and safe, and is vitally important for reinstating stable internal conditions following your class presentation. At the most fundamental level, the nervous system is really just a continuous loop of information, traveling from body to spinal cord to brain and back again. So what about long-term changes to the body? I mean, the nervous system applies influence nearly instantaneously. What about growth and physical transformation? Is that something the body just sorts out, or is the brain involved? And what about daily cycles? What's up with this go unconscious for 8 hours of every day of our entire existence? What regulates that? Well, let's take a look at the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a network of glands and organs capable of releasing chemicals into the blood that influence the behavior of individual cells elsewhere in the body. Now, on a human scale, alterations to these tiny structures result in big changes to things like metabolism, growth and development, and reproductive system function. These cell-altering substances are called hormones, and they're responsible for many daily physiological and behavioral activities, such as glucose metabolism, our stress response, red blood cell production, child labor and delivery initiation, and I could go on. Mitosis stimulation, fluid balances,
cardiac rhythm, libido, immune system function, plasma calcium levels, milk production and ejection, protein synthesis, gamete production, muscle relaxation, homeostasis, sodium and potassium levels, lymphocyte, internal,
Hormones also contribute to some more interesting things, like our diurnal behavior. Diurnal behavior is the opposite of nocturnal behavior, characterized by activity in the day and sleep in the night. Sleep is still pretty mysterious. Surprising, considering it makes up a third of our existence. It's this reoccurring state of immobility and mostly unconsciousness in which outside sensory activities have little to no impact on us. This period of unconsciousness is closely linked to the other conscious two-thirds of our lives, and the relationship between these two states is regulated in part by the hormones melatonin and cortisol. Cortisol is released from the adrenal glands and plays a role in waking us up as consciousness is regained with rising levels. It brings about a state of alertness in the body, increasing heart rate, respiration rate, and energy delivery to the muscles and the brain. Somewhat opposite to this is melatonin, released from the pineal gland. melatonin levels are kept low in the day and increase in the evening, inducing a state of tiredness and a desire to sleep through mechanisms like lowering our core body temperature. But how do these glands know when to release those hormones? How do they know day from night? Well, a few billion years of life on Earth, evolving under predictable and repeating patterns of light and dark, has led to the adoption of 24-hour cycles embedded deep in our biology. These cycles are called circadian rhythms, and almost every behavioral and physiological system in our bodies follows one. These rhythms are ultimately controlled by the brain, specifically by a tiny cluster of neurons called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is the central clock that dictates the behavior of almost every system in our bodies, including the release of melatonin and cortisol. Its function is tightly regulated by the expression of clock genes within individual neurons, which allow it to accurately keep time even without environmental cues. We literally have a clock in our head. If you were to move into a cave and live in complete darkness, giving the clock no environmental cues, no information on day and night cycles, well, it would continue to tick on a cycle averaging just a few minutes over 24 hours. For most of us non-cave dwellers, this clock can be modulated, most powerfully by light. Melanopsin is a light-sensitive protein found in specialized cells in the retina. To what degree these neurons influence our conscious vision is still being investigated, but they do form connections with the suprachiasmatic nucleus, feeding it information on light intensity, duration, and wavelength, which the clock uses to fine-tune its timing. In general, bright and blue wavelength light is the most potent stimulator of these cells, which is abundantly available from the sun. Light also has an inhibitory effect on melatonin release, preventing sleepy signals from impacting our day and encouraging them in the evening when light is low. Ultimately, this light-mediated fine-tuning of our brain's internal clock system helps to synchronize our sleep-wake cycles with the day-night cycles via hormone release. Now, I know what you're all wondering. Disruption to this sleep cycle is really quite easy and offers a range of benefits like memory and learning deficits, neuroplasticity disruption, and mood depression. Simply introduce some bright blue wavelength light, hold it barely a centimeter from your face in the late evening, and take that, biology. So what about growth? Well, the creatively named growth hormone is a largely anabolic substance partially responsible for physical development. It binds to protein receptors on the surface of many different cells, initiating intracellular pathways that ultimately cultivate growth and division. Pretty cool, right? Well, we haven't exactly answered the question of how the brain promotes hormone release. We know how the timing is regulated, and even what some do once they're released, but not how they're released. Well, at the base of the brain lies a small pea-sized cell cluster called the pituitary gland, sometimes referred to as the master gland. The pituitary releases a large number of hormones with diverse actions and exerts control over the function of all other endocrine glands. But this so-called master gland is really just a puppet doing the bidding of another, more powerful structure, one we've actually already seen, the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, while quite small, is immensely complex. It forms the bridge between the endocrine and nervous systems, as it receives inputs from the brain and its outputs affect the pituitary gland. Unlike what we've seen in the nervous system, the hypothalamus doesn't essentially have power lines going directly to the endocrine glands, nor does the pituitary. One of the main forms of control the brain exerts over the endocrine system is called feedback looping. Homeostasis refers to stable internal conditions that sustain life. As you can probably imagine, there are numerous variables like blood pressure and solute concentrations that need to be kept within very specific ranges to maintain this state. An efficient way to do this is through feedback mechanisms. If the variable is within a desired range, no action is needed. If it isn't, a sensor is activated, telling the body that change is needed, and some effector is called upon to correct the issue. Feedback loops are beautifully effective systems that allow the output of a component to be used as an input that directly affects the system's continued function. Let's say some stimulus pushes a regulated variable outside of homeostatic ranges. In this example, the change is detected by a sensory neuron, which fires into the central nervous system. Via integration of the signal, the central nervous system determines it can stabilize the variable through hormonal changes and sends a signal to the hypothalamus, inducing the release of hormone 1. Hormone 1 travels through local circulation and acts on the pituitary, causing hormone 2 to be released. Hormone 2, now in local circulation, goes back and binds to the hypothalamus to say, hey, that's enough, I've been released, you can stop now. And so hormone 1 secretion stops. The output of the hypothalamus led to an input that regulated its continued output, and this is called short-loop negative feedback. Now, in addition to hypothalamic binding, hormone 2 enters systemic circulation and binds to the cells of an endocrine gland somewhere else in the body, prompting the release of hormone 3. Hormone 3 enters systemic circulation, binds to a specific target, and forces a cellular response which counters the original distress stimulus that began the pathway. Hormone 3 can also feed back up the chain to both the pituitary and to the hypothalamus, decreasing their release of hormone 2 and 1 respectively, to prevent the regulated variable from being pushed out the other side of its homeostatic range. This is long-loop negative feedback. There are an astounding number of processes, like this complex neuroendocrine reflexive feedback loop, operating endlessly to keep you alive that you are never even aware of. They occur outside of the self-aware mind because they don't require conscious directions to function. We have no reason to experience or even be aware of the numerous neural and hormonal mechanisms that sustain every moment of our lives, as our autonomic and endocrine systems, among many others, do a phenomenal job without our conscious interference, as evidenced by the fact you're still alive.
The nervous and endocrine systems, colossal in both scope and complexity, are wielded by our brain to control the body. Their combined power facilitates our very existence, controlling life-sustaining functions we will never be aware of, the perception of the sensations that make up every experience we've ever had, daily cycles synchronized to the very motion of the nearly 6 septillion kilogram rock we call home, and the movement of the unique and complex biological machines we call our bodies. These mighty chemical and electrical systems bestowed upon us by the passing of time and the process of evolution allow us to live, to feel, to perceive the world around us, and to move throughout it. So, what are you waiting for? Get out there, do what you love, and put the systems you have to good use.